Hi everyone, so today I'm going to demonstrate and explain how to create a value drawing on tanned paper. Much like in my previous video where I worked on a sheet of hand-toned paper starting with that middle gray value, our tan paper here also starts us off with a middle tone. So I'm working from life, I'm working from a still life that I've got set up over here. Got a pair of boots of mine that I'm going to draw today. Got my light source coming in from the upper left. So I'm going to start this drawing off just like I do every other drawing with a block in. So first I'm going to use my viewfinder here to view my subject within the rectangle of the picture plane. That viewfinder window rectangle represents the outer edges of my paper. Just observing my subject here through the viewfinder to get the placement of my subject within the rectangle of the picture plane and the relative size. How big do I want that to be in there? So I've got two boots, one kind of more in profile, another one creating a smaller shape over here on the left. I want to fill out my picture plane. But I also don't want to have the contours of my subject end right on the edges of the picture plane or too close to the edge of the picture plane. I can create some undesirable visual tension. So I'm planning it out a little bit here with my viewfinder so that I can give my subject plenty of breathing room within the picture plane, but also to fill it out. So I've got a graphite pencil here, got my HB, I'm going to start there, got it sharpened to that really nice long point, and I'm going to use really light marks to block in my subject. Starting with the biggest shapes first, I'm going to use some light straight lines to kind of block in my subject. Use this opportunity here also to get my initial impressions of the subject, but also to find those relationships between parts of the whole. So I'm trying to look past smaller details here at the beginning and paying attention to bigger shapes. Bottom of the boot. You know, when I'm looking at the back edge of that boot on the right, I'm paying attention to how it relates to the center of the viewfinder window, the center of the picture plane. How close does it come to that? This viewfinder is helping me see that. So just to the left a little bit. So just my first guesses. I can make adjustments to this here in a little bit. And I've got my other boot. Make sure it's got enough room over here too. And again, I may need to adjust the sizes of these shapes here. Got two laces, extending out from the boots. Those are kind of nice little curvilinear elements that can draw the viewer's eye into our main subject here. This is a value drawing, so light and shadow are going to play a major role in this. Got a light shape on the back side of that right boot where light is hitting it more directly. Those bright light shapes, I want to pay attention to where those are at in my picture plane too, because they're going to create a focal point, an area of emphasis in my drawing. I'm getting a little bit close to the top edge of my drawing here. I might scoot it over here a little bit, and that's going to move this boot over. Boot on the left over a little bit. If you wanted to use charcoal, hey buddy, if you wanted to use charcoal for the block in, that would also work. I'll try graphite today. You want something a material that's going to allow you to make changes easily. Right? So if I wanted to shift something over like I did just then, I want to be able to do that easily and quickly. And so use light marks, whatever material you use for your blocking. Use that light touch. Using the side of the pencil, right, that allows me to get a looser, kind of broader, lighter mark. It's also allowing me to use more of my arm when I'm making marks, and that's good. You know, we're looking for those broad shapes and those broad angles. You can use the pencil almost like a paintbrush. So now I've got the placement in there. I'm going to bring in my measuring stick, a straight stick here to help me get a little more precision and refinement here in my blocking. So I want to start with the bigger shape, the conglomeration of the two boots together. So I'm going to look at the overall height versus the overall width of that biggest shape. The shorter measurement is the overall height. I'm going to get a visual measurement on my stick here of that, and I'm going to see how many of that measurement fit within the overall width. So the overall height is half of the overall width. And I observed that first, right, and took measurements. So now I'm going to refine my block in so that it also conveys that relationship that I observed. So if this is the very top of the boot, and let's make sure that that's where I want it to be. So kind of close to the center here. Center that up in the paper or in the viewfinder. That looks like a pretty good spot for that high point in that boot on the right. You can see down into it a little bit, and then the most point here down at the bottom. That's if I drop a vertical straight down from there, that's hitting the heel. There's the overall height in my drawing. I'm saying if that's the overall height, 2 of that should fit into the overall width. So this is the height. 1, 2. So my boot on the right, that toe of the boot is going to be extending out over to this point. It's a little close to the edges of the picture plane, but got about an equal or close to equal border on either side, so that'll work out just fine. That'll put my highlight on the left boot through here, highlight shape on my boot on the right here, little conglomeration, and then I'll balance that out with a little bit of light hitting the toe over here, maybe that cast shadow coming off of that right boot. Alright, so that overall height versus the overall width, that relationship, got that in there now. This gives me a packet envelope that my subject fits just inside of. That's the biggest shape of my whole drawing. And I want to make sure that that biggest shape has accurate proportions. If that biggest shape is off, then all these other smaller shapes and smaller relationships are going to be off as well. All right, so where do I go to next? I'm going to break this bigger shape up into 2 smaller shapes. I'll just simplify it and use right boot and left boot. So I'm looking for the placement of this leftmost point on the boot on the right. Like I did with the bigger shape, now I'll do the same thing with just this smaller shape of the right boot. So I'm going to get a measurement of the overall height, same measurement I got before, do this visually, compare that, see how many of that measurement fit within the overall width of the boot here. 1/2, close to that. I'm going to check it, about 1.5, maybe a little over 1.5. So if this is the overall height of my boot, I'm saying I observed that 1.5 of that measurement fits within from the leftmost point to the rightmost point. There's my rightmost point, there's 1/2. So this mark through here is about accurate, where we want that to be. How about this boot over here? It's a little trickier of a shape. I'm going to look at the uppermost point of just zeroing in on this boot here on the left. The uppermost point, if I on that boot, if I extend a horizontal across, where does it intersect this boot on the right? It's a little bit higher than halfway. It's coming out of that boot. There's a curve there. It's coming out just a little bit before that curve goes back in. It's coming out of there at a little bit of an angle upward, and then it turns down at another angle, and I can use my measuring stick to find that angle. If I line it up with the angle of the edge that I'm looking for, I can transfer that angle right over to my drawing. And this is also a good time to see where that angle, if I extend it beyond that shape, beyond that edge, where is it intersecting other parts of my subject? It creates this little negative shape in between the boots. This extends up a little more, turns this way, and that diagonal intersects up there, about halfway. Yeah, so there's a nice little kind of relationship that you can find right off the bat using a diagonal. It's another part, the top part of the boot extends out a little bit there. I'm starting to get a little bit into those details, smaller details, a little too much over here. Before I get too much further, I want to make sure I've got the proportions of the bigger shape accurate first. So let's back up a little bit here. I'm going to get a measurement of the overall width. And so say in my drawing, this is my overall width from the back edge to that edge. Get a visual measurement of that shorter measurement, the overall width. And then see how many fit within the overall height. One. It's almost square. So if that's the overall width of just that boot on the left, I observed that the overall height would be that measurement plus a little bit more. I'm going to check my drawing here and make sure it has that relationship accurate in there. I'm going to pull this up a little bit. That boot, that sole of that boot is curved, comes around. Might bring this up even more. And it does, you know, if I compare that to the very bottom heel, the boot on the right, extend a horizontal over, the bottom of this one is up a little higher. That's where my drawing is kind of throwing me off here. Let's move that up. Okay. So where would I go from here? Again, bigger shapes down to the smaller. What's the next biggest shape? What about this toe, this bottom part of this boot here on the right? From the toe, apex of the toe over here, if I extend a horizontal straight across, where does it intersect the heel? And where does it intersect this other boot on the left? Down here, this part, intersecting this boot through this area. Another thing I can use to check that is get a measurement from bottom of the heel up to that top part of the toe, get a vertical measurement on that, see how many of that measurement fit within the overall height, compare it to some other known that I've got here. So let's get a vertical measurement from the heel up to the toe. So intuitively I would think that that toe, the top part of the toe would be lower, but it's, you know, if I divide the overall height of the boot in half, it's just a little bit below half. So let's go check that again. It's a good idea to check your measurements. I don't have the steadiest hand or the best eyes, so I always find that I need to go back and check anyway. A little bit below half. Yeah, so that looks like a good spot there for the top part of that toe. A little more rounded than I've got. A little bulging. We'll get back into that later. It does curve down a little bit and then turns back up. The next part might be, where I could find would be where the laces come in on the boot, where the laces meet that toe. Where exactly does that lie? This is just kind of an approximation here. So I'm going to get a horizontal measurement from the very tip of the boot here, measure over horizontally to that point. If I drop vertical right down from that first eyelet on the boot, so I get a horizontal measurement of that. So let's see how many of that fit within the overall width of just this boot here. It's about 1/3 of this measurement. So I divide it into 3 equal parts. Somewhere in here. That's going to be where that first eyelet is on the boot. It's the leather part that comes in. There's a nice kind of gradual curve here to the sole of the boot. How thick is that sole compared to the boot? Doesn't quite turn up so quickly, Greg. If I run a vertical up from that front of that heel, I'm trying to figure out if I've got that in the right place. If I run a vertical up from there, where does it intersect the top of the boot? Does it line up? It's a little bit behind this. Just a tad. So yeah, I've got it in a pretty good spot right there. Turns down a little bit. Right now, as I'm constructing the top contour of the sole of the boot, there's this great relationship between that contour and then the one right below at the bottom of that sole. And as I'm sketching it, I'm paying attention to how far apart they are as we travel along that. At some points it gets closer together, thinner. At other areas it's further apart. As a check, I can find angles. So right now I'm measuring from the tip of that toe up to this part here, finding a diagonal relationship between them. Check and make sure my drawing has that relationship. Sometimes I tell my students in my classes to practice their ABCs, always be checking and correcting. Especially, if I see something that doesn't quite look right, I'm definitely going to go back and figure out what's throwing that off, what specifically is not looking right there. Let me quickly get in this section. It's diagonal through here. Some of these reference block-in lines, when I don't need them anymore, when they're starting to get into the way, go ahead and erase them. Just because we're sketching an inanimate object doesn't mean we can't give it some character, some life. One of the reasons why I chose these boots was that they're starting to take the shape of my foot. There's some interesting flesh-like contours and shadows happening in the leather on the boot that can relate to the figure. And I've had these boots for some time and used them for a lot of different things. I wore them the other day when I mowed the lawn. There's still some dirt and dust and grass on them. I like that. I like that character there. Let's get over into this boot on the left and start to shape that up a little bit. Got the sole coming out there. Got some angles. Find angle relationship here between this heel and that heel. Nice shallow diagonal. Got an interesting perspective, interesting angle on this boot. It's not one that we're used to seeing, but I like that because now I'm forced to analyze it, not as a boot. I don't have any preconceived notions about what this boot looks like, because when I picture a boot in my mind, I'm not seeing it like this at this angle, right? I might be seeing it more close to this profile, but this angle here, this perspective of the boot is a little bit foreign to me, but I like that. It's forcing me to see the boot as a conglomeration of abstract shapes. I have to look more closely. I want our marks to be made from direct observations of our subject, getting past those assumptions about what we're looking at. Tongue sticks up a little bit. And just like I did in this other boot, I'm looking at this spacing in between these two contours. Gets a little closer together up through here. A little bit further apart, very subtle around there, around the tip of the boot. Block-in is coming along pretty well here. Started erasing some of my initial block-in measurement lines. I like to keep those lines in there as long as I can because I use them. These horizontals and verticals that help me find relationships. They can help me find additional relationships as the drawing progresses to smaller and smaller shapes. So I like to keep them in there for as long as I can. At some point, they gotta go. Because I was using the side of the pencil and making these kind of wider, broad marks. When I'm refining these marks, now I can go back in with my kneaded eraser and draw with the kneaded eraser, kind of sculpt. And this allows me to make additional visual passes over my subject. If I see anything that looks off, I can make corrections to it. So make sure you're going back through and checking and correcting. You might ask, well, why does it need to be so accurate? I like to have that accuracy in there because as the artist, it allows me to convey my message, my content, my themes, my meaning a little more clearly, and I think successfully. Drawing, painting, art, it's a visual language. It's a visual communication. Our tools, our alphabet, our language, as visual artists are basic elements of art. Line, shape, value, texture, color, space. And so the better handle we have on that language, the more successfully we can communicate our message. All right, so now I'm thinking about what elements of my foreground and background do I want to include in here? What elements are going to add add to the content, the meaning, the goal of the drawing, and what elements take away from that. I've got these laces, and there's some great curves to these laces. This one travels down through this way and then passes over that intersection of the heel and the sole. What I really like about that lace is that curve right through here, where part of it's resting on the table and then it continues up. So that lace, that curved line, is going to serve as a point for the viewer of the drawing to follow and to guide their eye in a specific deliberate path. One of many paths in the drawing, but I really like this path because it extends down into the foreground. So I'm going to keep it in there, but because it's an untied lace, I can pretty much put it wherever I want and it'll still be believable in there. So I'm going to use that to my advantage. Let's put a little more of that character into the toe of the boot here. That little part of the leather that comes down, turns down through here. Bring this up just a little bit more. You know, I don't want to get carried away with the eyelets here and these little details. I'll put a few of them in. If I just suggest some of them, that's okay. Some of them can kind of fade away or maybe not be totally described, but maybe just a little indication of something there. Let the viewer's mind kind of fill in the rest. You know, think about placement too. A little bit closer together through here. Flap of leather is turning back and around the boot. Some laces that turn up. It's loose, right? So I'm gonna emphasize that lace. There's a few laces here that are turned loose. Nice curve. And when you're making these marks, notice too that the darker marks tend to pop forward. So this lace here that I want to recede, I'll lighten that line up a little bit, and that pushes it back into space. It makes the darker marks pop forward more. I want those to read as being in front of other parts there, so that helps. So what about that lace that's coming down? So I'm kind of lightly looking for how I could put that in there. I'm going to put it behind this notch in the heel here, this front part of the heel. It is resting on the table. This lace comes down really close to, and it actually overlaps this part through here. So I'm looking for that curve of that lace in there. Where's going to be a good spot for it compositionally? Maybe this works kind of nicely. I can make it a little more curvy if I can emphasize that curvature. Might be able to add a little more gesture, a little more dynamism to the drawing. Not this one creeping out over here. What if it came out over here? The reason why I'm fussing over these laces and the curve and the direction of them is that these are opportunities here for me to find additional relationships All right, so as I'm sketching the curve in through here at this particular angle, if I continue that, I can see it kind of flows nicely into something else, or leads the eye to some other intersection or some other point in the drawing. So not only do we have a path that follows up here to this part of the boot, there's another linear path that the viewer can follow. It's a compositional aspect that can make the drawing more than just a simple study of these boots. I'm going to indicate some light and shadow shapes here, so I'm going to block in some of these shadow shapes. The transitions between these light and shadow shapes is gradual, so there's not a clear defined edge to some of them. And so I'm going to squint my eyes to kind of give them a little more of an edge, to see where the shadow shape and the light shape begins and ends. Some great light and shadow shapes and folds happening on the leather of the boot. It's a great highlight that I also want to keep over here, where light is, the boot is kind of turned away from me, and I want to make sure that I have that. So the way to indicate that is that the bottom, the sole, it's not totally horizontal. It's got a little bit of a tilt to it. That's going to help indicate that our boot is turning away from us a little bit. So some of that light is being caught over here. There's a little shadow and light shape that I'm going to put in here. That'll be a nice little, another unique characteristic to the boot I have in here. And there's also a great cast shadow from the boot. It kind of gets diffused, continuing from the sole. I want to have that extend outside the picture plane a little bit. Cast shadow. We got a few cast shadows coming from the string. Just counting the eyelets on the boot to make sure I had the right number. I'm not making them really defined, but if I'm going to indicate them, I should make sure that there is a certain degree of accuracy to those too. Few eyelets on this one that we can see. Some ellipses, indication of ellipses would be fine. So spend some time on your block in, refining it, making many visual passes over my subject to help me refine these contours and get a little more accuracy in them. Spend some time on that. It's well worth the time and effort that you put into it. Alright, so now that I've got the blocking complete, now I'm going to focus on developing light and shadow. So I've got a tan base. If we look at our value scale, that tan, is about a value 6 or 7 or so, somewhere in the middle range of our value scale. So we're starting out with a middle range tone already. So I'm going to focus on developing the darkest darks, my shadows, my darkest shadows, and also my brighter values happening in my highlights, my subject. I'm going to bring in some black charcoal as well as some white charcoal. For my black charcoal, I've got these sticks of Nitram Charcoal, H grade Nitram. It's a stick of B grade, softer. It's going to make a darker mark. And then I've also got a HB grade of Nitram Charcoal, which is kind of in the middle. I'm going to start with this HB, this middle range charcoal, and see how that lays out onto the paper. If it's too dark, I can switch to the H, which will make a lighter mark. If it's not dark enough, I can always switch over to the B, which will make a darker tone. For the white, I've got this General's white charcoal pencil. Got it sharpened to that nice long tapered point. That'll help me get a little more precision. Could also use white Conte, that would work also. So I'm going to start with the darkest darks here, my dark shadow shapes. So I'm going to look at my subject and see where those are at. The underside of the sole on this boot is a nice dark shape. Our cast shadows underneath the soles are also going to be dark shadow shapes. Where the leather on the boot, this boot here, turns down and meets the sole, you get a dark shadow shape. I'm going to make sure to put that in there. That'll make sure that it looks like our boot is rounded, has that rounded form through there. So I'm going to start laying in and massing in some of these dark shadows. And I want to try to make it as even and consistent of an area of the tone as I can. So I'll work in a consistent, even manner. Got this HB here, and it seems to be working pretty well. You can see my tone. I'm going to work in multiple directions. I'm also not pressing really hard. I want to approach these tones gradually. I don't want to create a dark tone with pressure necessarily. That could damage the paper, and it could also make it hard to correct and change later on, to erase. And I'm just going for an initial first light layer of tone. I'm mapping out the shadow and the light shapes. Where are they at? And I'm locating them by putting an initial light layer of tone in there. This whole area has a cast shadow through here. I do sort of start to lose an edge down in here. Back edge of this heel is still very distinct, so make sure I maintain that. Of course, underside here is really dark shadow shape. Continues on over here to the side, cast shadow. This shadow shape on the underside of the boot, on the underside of the upper part of the boot, it's going to gradually transition. It's darkest right there where it meets the sole, and it's going to gradually transition to the light shape above it. Still pretty dark for a while up here. We don't get super bright until a little bit higher up in the boot. So I could start by establishing a dark tone pretty much over this whole part of the boot. Shadow shape continues up. I want to use the tan of the paper. I want to use that middle range tone as much as I can in the drawing. And after I make an initial pass, I'm kind of blending it out, smoothing it out, moving it around with my finger. This evens out the tone. If you don't want to use your finger, you could use a blending stump or a paper towel. Just make sure you're not pressing down really hard. your shadows recede in space. So as I'm blending that initial layer or two of charcoal out with the blending stump, it's starting to recede more. That shadow shape is pushing back. So it's reading more as a shadow. That's good. That's what I want. Some more shadow shapes up through here. Can kind of mask these in a little more quickly by using the broad side edge of the stick of charcoal. Using the side edge, though, it doesn't get down too far down into the recesses of the paper here, so you can see it's really spotty, it's really inconsistent. So I might need to go back in and get another layer of tone in there at a steeper angle so that some of that tone gets into those recesses. When I blend it out, that also helps to kind of to push it down into those spots. Okay, comes up a little more. Still making visual passes over my subject to make sure that I'm getting the shape of the shadow accurate to how I'm seeing it in my subject. Did another video about techniques and ways to create even, consistent areas of tone. Check that out if you're interested. I'll go into a little more detail about some of the techniques that I'm using here to create even, consistent tone. Technique of drawing is an indirect kind of technique, right? Developing the drawing in stages. Block in is the first stage. Value map is the second. Developing the drawing in those stages simplifies the process and allows you to focus on just one or two things at a time, one step at a time. As I'm massing in these values and these tones, and as I'm assessing where the darkest darks and lightest lights are in my drawing, I don't have to worry about accuracy or proportions or sizes because I've already spent a significant amount of time on that in the first stage. This frees me up to focus on just the value. But because of that, the drawing remains pretty abstract and pretty unkempt, unrefined for quite a while, right? And if it's not looking to your satisfaction in these in-between stages, don't give up on it. Keep going. To bring back some of the highlights, bring in my eraser, work subtractively. This one carries down a little bit, turns down. It's a little diffused and a little lost through here. Go and start to add a second layer of tone to this underside of the leather to really establish that. This is an element that's in the closer areas of the drawing, closer to the picture plane, closer to the viewer. Therefore, we're going to have more contrast, a higher range of values in those areas. You know that from our knowledge of atmospheric perspective. We can utilize some of the knowledge we know from landscapes to help us achieve a more dynamic, interesting drawing. Crisper edge through here. Got a little dark spot that's distracting. I might pull that back up out of there. That shadow shape gets thin. As that sole gets closer to the surface, the spacing in between the bottom of the sole and the contour of the shadow shape gets thinner and closer together. Keep that in there. Tone down this sole back here, get another good layer going in here. It does get lighter as it goes up, but it's still really dark. When I'm assessing the particular value in a shadow shape, I'm looking at it compared to other shadow shapes in my subject. This establishes overall value relationships. We want those relationships to be accurate. So I'm assessing the value on the underside of the sole. I'm looking at it compared to another dark shadow somewhere else, maybe to the shadow on the boot. Some of the shadows up through here. It gets darkest down through here. And that gets about as dark as we're seeing inside the boot up here. This part that we can see down into. When I observe those relationships, I want to make sure that my drawing also has that relationship in there. Comparing values to each other. I've got a good first initial pass in value laid into these shadow shapes. What I want to do next is start to add some white to these highlighted areas. So I've got my white charcoal pencil here, and you can see I like to rest my hand against the paper. It gives me a little more control. But sometimes you may find that if you got to rest your hand over a part of the drawing, that's not such a good thing. It'll smudge it. What you can use to help with that is what they call a maul stick. This is one made out of metal that I got off of Dick Blick. Works pretty well. You can take one end, rest it against your drawing board or your easel, hold the other end in your hand, your non-drawing hand, and then you can rest your hand against that bridge, that maul stick, instead of your drawing. So I use this a lot to help prevent smudging in my drawing. It also gives me a little more control. I'm going to start with this bright highlight happening front part of the boot. If you blend this white charcoal pencil with some of the black, it can do kind of funny things. It might change the tone of the white to a bluer tone. So you want to be careful. I like to try to keep them as separate as I can. So I'm using the side of the pencil here and just getting a light layer into this light shape. And just like the shadow, I want to create even, consistent white tone as well. Working in the direction of the contour of the boot. So highlight down here in heel. This shape may be getting away from me a little bit. And it is. So if I move my eye quickly back and forth between my subject and my drawing, I'm seeing some inconsistencies in this shape. I'm going to go ahead and correct those. Kind of rounds out a little more than what I got. Just extend that shape down through here. starting to blend down into the charcoal, so I'm going to get some of that charcoal out of there. Let some of that tone shine, show through in the transition. I'll come back to that here in a little bit to develop the form and the transitions between light and shadow a little more directly. But for now, I should keep my focus on the bigger shapes of light. They're happening here. That light continues up through this part of the boot. And this was a shape that I was struggling with in the blocking. Nice bright white shape through here. Go ahead and remove my contours in charcoal so I can lay in a good layer of white without worrying about blending that charcoal in there. The light kind of travels, continues down. I like that. So I like that little highlight. It's going to give a little bit of a shine to the leather. I don't want to make that too shiny. Approach that light very gingerly. Or not. Sliver of highlight that continues around the edge of the boot. And I went a little too far in with this highlight on the white, so I'm going to take some. Now the light is cascading and coming into this other part of the drawing. A little sliver that travels down over this fold. I want that to continue into this part of the drawing here too. Maybe that's up a little too high. Let's drop it down just a bit. So even though my attention is on light and shadow, when I see a proportion or a size or a shape that's off, I'm still going in and correcting. Don't be afraid to make corrections to things as we're making more passes in the light and shadow stage here too. It's a great little highlight on the bottom of the heel. It's not super bright, but I'm going to put that in there. Just on this edge a little bit. Area on the toe, which I really like. It's going to be a tricky area because we've got some black charcoal over here that I don't really want to run into. Make sure that this boot, toe of the boot, maintains its roundness. So I'm going to pull some of that light down across this curved part of the boot. Getting those light shapes in there. Kind of helps us determine, you know, how far we need to push the darkest darks. Do they really need to go to black? Do we need a background in there? Got some highlights on the laces here. I'm gonna go ahead and put those in. Up through here is going to be a part that I want to make sure I get in there, these highlights. This is going to curve. So that shape is getting a little out of whack. Go back in and make some corrections there. Dark spot part of the shadow. Let's pull out this lace here. We lost my eraser. And you know, at this point now, it's a matter of determining how much we can say with as few marks, as few as little as information maybe as possible. Let the tone of the paper do its job, read as a tone. Let the viewer's mind fill in as much as we can. I don't necessarily want to delineate and describe every single contour that I'm seeing. Textures are kind of nice in the charcoal. Gives a little more character and life to the boot. I may smooth them out here in a little bit. I just wanted to see what that would look like. Try a variety of marks. Don't be afraid to hold the charcoal on its side and try out making some marks that way. We do lose an edge in the back part of that boot on the right through here, where the value in the shadow matches the value on the boot itself. So we get a lost edge. I'm really going to want to punch up that, or punch back, put some more black into that sole to make that overlap this boot pop forward even more. Back to this part here, because there are some good highlights that I want to make sure I keep in there. I'm looking at the light as it continues into the top ridge of that part of the boot. We catch more light on the front edge here as it turns back toward the light. So I'm going to go ahead and establish that. Value's relative, right? So if I wanted to make this edge appear brighter, I'm going to make the surrounding tone darker. And I need to push that value anyway. It's really dark right underneath of there. Dark shadow shape that comes through here. Lots of contrast. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. Let's switch to darker charcoal. the beat and start to lay in a little bit more tone in this sole over here. From here, I'm going to continue to develop these shadow shapes, pushing those values darker, getting a little more of the transitions in between the light and the shadow shape, developing those more, softening them up. Bring in some charcoal pencil with a finer point to get a little more precision and detail. And then go back over these highlights here too, to kind of help punch those up where needed and refine those. That's our third stage, right? Developing form, modeling form. Bringing out some of my General's charcoal pencils here to hammer in some of these darker shadows.